G'day team, Matt Krumins here and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to tackle the age-old question of what prime should I buy? And that is not just what should I buy, but what prime should I buy that I will actually use? So let's jump straight into it. As you may know, prime lenses have a few major advantages over their zoom counterparts. For an example, I shoot on the 70-200 f2.8 as a pretty go-to lens, but I also have a 135mm prime which fits into the range of my 70-200. So why on earth would I buy a double up? Well, for a start, prime lenses, generally speaking, have a much wider aperture than what our zoom range does. So it's an f2.8 on the zoom, it's an f1.8 on my prime. The lens that I'm shooting this on is also a 35mm prime, and that's an f1.4. Now, if you're not familiar with f-stops, the f1.4 versus f2.8 is the difference between the size of the hole in the lens. So there's a couple of advantages to that. The first one is that we're going to get much more light coming through the lens, right? So the more light that we have from the aperture, the less light we need from other places. So that could increase our shutter speed, which means in low light photography, we can get faster shutter speeds. That's going to result in having less motion blur or potential for motion blur. It would also be a situation where we could get less light from our ISO because we're getting it from the aperture, which means we can photograph at lower ISOs, and therefore we get less grain or noise in our image, as well as some other advantages, things like better dynamic range and stuff like that. Now, to be honest, that's not really why I shoot with prime lenses. I'm not terribly worried about the low light aspect of it. My camera can shoot high ISOs, no issues. I don't really get too stressed about grain or noise. But I use it for two other things. For the first one, I use it because the f1.8 is going to give me a heaps blurrier background than what my f2.8 will. And my f1.4 is going to give me tremendously blurrier backgrounds than my f1.8 and my f2.8. And so what we want to think about here is, why do we want a prime lens in the first place? Now, we get better low light, we get blurrier backgrounds with our lens, and this is probably most applicable to the wider angle lenses. So my 35mm lens, if I shot my, my general zoom, it's f2.8, I don't really get a lot of drop off in the background at f2.8. f1.4 though, I get tons of drop off in the background, which really helps to separate out my subject and make them really stand out. My audience always knows exactly where to look. I'll show you a couple of examples here where you can really see the subject pops off that background, and yeah, tremendous difference when you're starting to look at it from the blurry background perspective. The other thing that these primes do, if we look at purely the technical side of it, is that they are a lot sharper than a zoom lens in general. Now that applies to the higher end prime lenses. Some of the low end prime lenses, things like the nift-50s, the sharpness is really not that great. You get beautiful blurry backgrounds, but the subject's also not that sharp. When you go into those more pro ranges, things like the Sigma Art series of prime lenses, or if you're looking at the higher end Canon, Nikon, Sony, Olympus, Fuji, you name it, those lenses are tremendously sharp prime lenses. And it does make a big difference because the sharper your subject, the less blurry your background needs to be to make it pop out, because really what makes it pop is the difference in sharpness. Blurry background, sharp subject. So prime lens can give you some really great results like that. You could also argue that prime lenses are a great way to help you, I guess, get more creative, because they don't allow you just to zoom in on something. You really have to think about your compositions and move around a lot to get the shot that you're after. That said, what we're here to discuss today is, how do you choose a prime lens that's actually going to suit you? Because it is a very specific focal length. You don't buy a prime with a range in it, it is just that focal length. And so there's a couple of really cool tricks that I've got in Lightroom to help work out what you should buy, not what someone else thinks you should buy. Because at the end of the day, we all photograph differently and we all have different compositions in mind and different things that we want to create. So let's jump into Lightroom and I'll show you around what is going on here. So I'm in my library, and what I've done is I've created a collection. I haven't moved anything out of a folder. I've created a collection of some of my best shots or my favorite shots. Now, for you, this might be shots from a particular holiday, or it might be, you know, your recent shoots. For me, I'm just going to show you a demonstration today using all the photographs that I've got in my gallery. Now, if you look on here, you'll see there's quite a few shots in there. And when I'm in the the library tab, you'll see I've got this library filter bar that's sitting along the top here. Now, if that bar isn't there, you can hit Command F on your keyboard or Control F, and it should pop up with a little search find thing. That usually brings it up if it wasn't there in the first place. Very rare that it's not there though. Now you'll see there's some tabs in this. You've got text, you've got attributes, you've got metadata, and you've got none. So if we go to none for a second, this is what your standard view would be. When we go to metadata, what it's going to do is bring up this really big, long list of all the metadata and the data that sits in behind your photos. Now, you can spend hours, days, weeks in here trolling through this data, and there's some really interesting stuff, especially it brings out or shows you a lot of the habits, good and bad, that you have when you're shooting. But for today, what we're going to be using is the little one up here, which says focal length. Now, if yours doesn't say focal length, it's really easy to change. You just click on these little arrows and you can choose any piece of metadata that you'd like. So I want you to hit focal length. Now, it's really important at this point to recognize that if you have more than one camera format, so for instance, a micro four thirds and a full frame camera, or maybe you've got a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera, that Lightroom doesn't take into account the crop factor when showing you these. So you might have chosen this photo as being your favorite shot, and you might go, wow, that was actually shot on 35 millimeters, I love it. But if it was taken on a crop sensor camera, say for instance a micro four thirds, which has a 2x crop, that 35 is actually the equivalent of 70 millimeters. And so it's really important that when you're going through this process, you understand that different camera sensor sizes will give you a different crop factor. So a micro four thirds camera is 2x. A APS-C camera is 1.5 to 1.7 times, depending on your brand. And then of course with full frame, we don't need to factor it in. And if you've got something bigger than a full frame, like a medium or large format, then you need to do the reverse crop to get these numbers working for you. So if you've only got one camera type, it's not really all that important to keep this in mind. But if you have multiple camera formats, it's very, very important that you try and standardize these numbers before you go down this path. Otherwise, you might not be comparing apples with apples. So I'll give you an example here. In mine, I've got the GH2, the EM1, the EM5, the EM5 Mark II, and the EPL3 actually. They all have micro four thirds sensors. So I'm going to select all of those cameras, and that will update the information in the focal length column to say that I'm now only looking at my micro four thirds cameras. If I was to do my full frame cameras, I would need to select the Sony A1, the D810 and the D850. And now the information in the focal length panel is only relating to the 3 cameras that I've chosen there. So they're all equivalent. So we'll go with this example here. When I've selected all my full frame cameras, you can now see that there's 144 photos out of the 204 photos selected that were shot on my full frame cameras. So out of my 204 top photos that I'm stoked with, 144 of them are from my full frame cameras. Now, you can see in here, it says there are 36 different focal lengths that I used. Now this is different from using what lens did I shoot on, because if you've got a zoom lens, something that's got a range like 70 to 200, well, there's no point in me knowing that 50 of my photos were taken on my 70 to 200, because it doesn't tell me where on that zoom range that I actually shot them. So instead we're using the focal length tab. And what you'll see here is that out of the 144 photos that I've selected, 30 of those photos are at 16 millimeters. Now that's sort of pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. That's over a quarter of the photos, just under a quarter of the photos that I shot, they're in my favorites, were at 16 millimeters. If I scroll down, you'll see that 18 millimeters, which is close enough to 16, that can get lumped in with it. 19, 20, 21, 22, didn't really get used a whole lot, but at 24 millimeters, I had 12 shots out of the 144. So 10% of my photos almost were shot at 24 millimeters. If I keep going down, these numbers are very small and not very noteworthy, but when I get to 35 millimeters, all of a sudden again, you go, hey, 12 shots, that's 10% of my photos were taken at roughly 35 millimeters. We keep scrolling down, you'll see there's a bit of a gap in between. I don't tend to shoot at 37, 44, 47, 59. You notice here there's a complete absence of 50 millimeters. I very, very, very rarely shoot at 50 millimeters. Now that's just my personal style, but here's the thing. Most advice that you get when you're buying a prime lens is to shoot at 50 millimeters, to buy a nift-fifty. That would make no sense for my own photography. Instead, as we're going down here, you'll see the other spikes that we get are at 400 millimeters. So for me, a prime lens, if I'm looking at buying something, I should be thinking about looking at that 400 millimeter focal length. I should be thinking about something in the 35 millimeter focal length, something in the 24 millimeter focal length, or something really wide at the 16 millimeter focal length or thereabouts. Because they're the focal lengths that I use most. When I take shots and I go, hey, I'm really proud of those, they came from those focal lengths, not 50 millimeters or 85 millimeters where someone else told me to buy a prime lens. So this is a really cool trick in Lightroom because it gives us the ability to make decisions based on our own photography style and our own photography habits, rather than what someone else does, because we all shoot things differently. We all have different looks that we're going for, different subject matter, and just different styles. So using Lightroom, using real data, you're gonna get what you want with lenses you will actually use. So keep this in mind next time you go lens shopping or before you go lens shopping. I hope it's been useful. As always, team, please subscribe to my brand new channel. Hit the like button there. If you hit the little alert bell thing, it'll tell you when new videos are come up. And I look forward to bringing you more videos in the very near future, especially adding to my learning gallery, where we dissect images that I've taken, some of my favorites, and we talk about the composition, we talk about the settings, and then we go through a full bare all edit. Really look forward to doing that with you guys. Thanks for joining me again.